Well, hey everybody, welcome to the Ransom. It's great to have you here today. Thank you for coming to worship with us. Hey, we're continuing our series called Foundations, a blueprint for extraordinary faithfulness. And we're looking at some characters in the Old Testament and asking how their lives might help us live more faithful lives today in our context. And today we're going to be talking about a guy named Daniel. Now, Daniel's got a book named after him, the book of Daniel, of course. And the question that the book of Daniel compels us to ask is this: how do you change things when you're not in charge and everyone disagrees with you? How do you change things when you're not in charge and everyone disagrees with you? Maybe this is relevant for you at your work. Maybe you're not the boss, but you've got convictions, and nobody in the office agrees with you on those. Or maybe something similar can be said at school or at home. I don't know. The question is, how do you lead when you're not in power? Now, God's people, we've known power from pretty much every angle. We were powerless slaves in Egypt. You can read about that in the book of Exodus. All right, and then we had a powerful monarchy. You can read about that in 2 Samuel. And then we were exiled under foreign nations. That's 2 Kings chapter 25. You can read about what went down there. All right, and then, we were occupied by empires like Rome. And then there's, in the Middle Ages, about 1,500 years where the church was pretty powerful. In fact, historians made up a word to describe it. It's the word Christendom. It's where they took the word Christ and the word kingdom and kind of smushed them together. This is a time in history where kings would kneel down before popes because the church held power. And so the question is, where are we today? There was a day where the church was the center of every community, where prayer was assumed at government functions and where pastors were held up as leaders in the community. I don't know, I think those days are kind of over. But here's the thing. I'm not entirely sure that's a bad thing. Let me tell you why. Because if it's the case that God's people, once again, don't hold the power, if the ball of cultural decision-making is not in our hands anymore, if the broader culture no longer really cares what Christians think about a given issue, that means that we actually have an opportunity not to get the power back, but to do something even better. To do something more important, something that I think we may have been placed on earth to do. It could be the very thing that we are best at, and that is that we have the opportunity to speak truth to the ones in power. We have the opportunity to speak truth to the ones that are in power. Think about this for a second. If you grew up in the church, maybe you went to Sunday school and you heard all the Bible stories. What are some of the greatest moments in the Bible? Is it not when we are speaking truth to the ones in charge? Okay, this is Moses before Pharaoh. Hey, God says, let my people go. This is David before Goliath. Hey, I've killed the lion and the bear, and this Philistine is going to go down. This is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego before Nebuchadnezzar. Hey, maybe God will save us, maybe he won't, but whatever happens, we will never bow down to your idol. This is Jesus before Pontius Pilate saying, all the power you have it was given to you from above. This is Peter and John before the Sanhedrin saying, hey, do you think that God wants us to obey you rather than him? The list could go on and on and on. I'm convinced that this is what we do best. Not necessarily being in charge, but being a faithful witness before the ones who are. Because when we do it well, when we get that right, folks, the world changes. Revolutions happen. Revival happens when we do this well. Now, today you sit in a church that's part of a denomination called the Wesleyan Church. Some of you may be surprised to hear that. I've talked to a lot of people that come to the Ransom who didn't know that we were part of a denomination. They think we're non-denominational. Well, we don't make a big point to talk about it a lot because we kind of want to major on Jesus, talk about him more than anything. But sometimes it's appropriate to bring it up. And so today I want to talk a little bit about our heritage as Wesleyans, as a Wesleyan church. Down in South Carolina, there sits on the campus of one of our 5 Wesleyan universities a church. It's called Freedom's Hill Church. It's on the campus of Southern Wesleyan University. And it was planted in the year 1848 by a man named Adam Crooks. All right, we got a picture of Adam right there. He's a good-looking, fine young lad. He's the good beard points going on. And as a 19-year-old, Adam Crooks heard a sermon on the evils of slavery. And when that happened, he knew what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be a preacher, and he wanted to be an abolitionist. And so when a group of Christians in the heart of the South decided to break away from their church because their church was not against slavery, They could no longer worship in a church that was for slavery. They broke away and wrote to the Wesleyans in Ohio. You see, they had heard about this strange new movement of Wesleyans, of Christians who opposed slavery, and they wrote to them and said, hey, can you send us a preacher? Because there aren't any preachers down here that are against slavery. Can you send us one? And so the Wesleyan Conference, they met together, and they would not appoint a preacher to go south because it was too dangerous, but what they did do was they asked for volunteers. One eyewitness says that after a season of prayer, Brother Crooks arose, his cheeks pale as marble. I will go, he said. Sustained by your prayers in the name of my Savior, I will go to North Carolina. So Freedom's Hill became the first Wesleyan church in the South. And within just 2 years, because of their efforts, 8 more Wesleyan churches had been planted in North Carolina and Virginia. But with an increasing profile came increasing troubles as well. You see, Adam Crooks was drugged from his pulpit. He was beaten behind the church, and people tried to kill him. He survived an assassination attempt. He survived a poisoning attempt. There's 11 bullet holes in the door of Freedom's Hill Church, left there by people trying to scare away the worshipers there. Another man named Micaiah McPherson, he was one of the founding members of Freedom's Hill Church. He was an outspoken abolitionist. He was captured one night and hanged from a tree. A few hours later, the mob came back and they cut him down, saying they needed the rope to go hang another Wesleyan. Little did they know he wasn't dead, and his wife nursed him back to health, and he lived into his 80s. Now, the opposition wasn't just from the mob. The courts themselves got in on the action. They tried to silence the Wesleyans in Jamestown and in Winston-Salem. There's a law specifically prohibiting, quote, true Wesleyans from speaking on public property. There was a Methodist church that wrote into its bylaws that preachers from any denomination were welcome in the pulpit except, quote, those notorious fanatics commonly called true Wesleyans, and they are to be forever barred from any privilege in said church. By the way, those notorious fanatics, that's us. All throughout Indiana and Michigan, there are Wesleyan churches that were part of the Underground Railroad, this complex system of businesses and churches and homes that would shelter slaves as they were running for their freedom to Canada. I could go on and on about this. Almost 2 years ago now, Hillary Clinton stood on a stage in New York to accept the nomination for president, the first woman nomination for president by a major party. And as she spoke in her speech, she talked about the women's rights movement that started right there in New York, not far from where she was giving her speech in a church 150 years ago. She probably didn't know this, but that church was a Wesleyan church. You see, the reason I'm going on like this is because I want you to know that when you sat in your seat today, you entered into a history that is no stranger to speaking truth to power. And it's gotten us beaten and poisoned, imprisoned, hanged and killed. But we have been saying things that everybody knows to be true 150 years after the fact. You see, when we speak truth before the ones in power, the world changes. Now, Daniel lived at a time that probably felt like the apocalypse. It literally felt like the end of the world. I mean, God's people had been captured, the temple had been pillaged, the holy items from the temple were on display in a pagan temple, and a king sat on the throne that did not care 2 cents for God's laws. King Nebuchadnezzar brought Israel's finest young men into the palace to turn them into human propaganda. That was his goal. You see, his hope was that if he took Israel's finest leaders and indoctrinated them into the ways of the Babylonians, then they would go back to their people and teach them those ways, influence them, and soon Israel as a nation would just kind of evaporate and it would be assimilated into the Babylonians. And so he taught them their language, he taught them their religion, he gave them their food, he even gave them Babylonian names. And that's where we're going to pick up the story. We'll be in Daniel chapter 1, verses 6 through 8. If you have a Bible, please open. If you don't, put your hand in the air. The ushers will bring you one. If you're using one of our church Bibles, we'll be on page 522. Page 522. And if you don't have a Bible, you can keep the one that we're giving you. So Daniel chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, page 522 in the church Bibles. It says, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, Azariah was called Abednego. But Daniel was determined. I tried to get my wife to let us name our son Shadrach. She didn't like it. I don't get it. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Okay, so Daniel and his friends are given Babylonian names. We're not entirely sure what they mean. Some scholars think that they're actually words that are giving praise to the Babylonian gods, kind of as a way to add insult to injury, you know? Like, we're not only going to capture you and we're going to oppress you, but now we're going to change your names to something that actually glorifies our gods instead of yours. And so that's what he's doing. And there's a funny little play on words in the original language that this is written in. It literally says that the king placed these names on them. And then in the next verse, the same word occurs. It says that Daniel placed on his heart not to defile himself. The king placed new names on Daniel and his friends, but Daniel placed on his heart that he wasn't going to defile himself before the Lord. You see, Daniel had a choice to make. He was being invited into power. He was being given an opportunity to actually make lemonade out of lemons. I mean, he could live a pretty decent life. This is life in the palace. This is free education, free food. All he has to do is fall in like a good little Babylonian would. And he'd have a pretty decent life. But that's not what he does. Daniel decides to remain faithful so that he can speak truth before those who are in power. Listen, the ability to speak truth to power is given to those who desire faithfulness over power. The ability to speak truth to power is given to those who desire faithfulness over power. And so if you want to change your circumstances, if you want to be an influencer in this world, it has to start with this unwavering faithfulness to God. Do you remember our Home Run Life series? Okay, this is home plate. This is your connection with God. This is the place that you must always start. Daniel started at home plate with his connection to God, and he did not run the bases backwards. You see, we all face compromising circumstances every single day. You know, some of us have a lot to gain if we'd only compromise a little. Maybe a promotion at work, or maybe we could gain a fun relationship that frankly isn't appropriate. Or maybe we could gain popularity in the office. We're constantly faced with the opportunity to compromise a little in order to gain a lot. But here's the thing. When you compromise a little, you usually end up compromising everything. When you compromise a little, you usually end up compromising everything. You want to know how I know that? I'll tell you how I know that. It's because you or I have never eaten just one Dorito. It's physically impossible. I see the bag of Doritos lying there, and I think to myself, hey, I'm just going to have me one little Dorito. And so I take it. No sooner has it touched my lips, and my hand's already back in the bag grabbing for more. And it's like my lizard brain kicks in, and I'm just all instinct now. There's no reason going on. I'm just shoveling those things in there with a wild look in my eyes until somebody pulls the bag away. Maybe that's just me. I don't know. Listen, if you cheat on God here, you'll do it again there. But every time you do it, the stakes get a little higher, don't they? By the way, it's funny when we're talking about Doritos, but it's not so funny when we're talking about our marriage. It's not so funny when we're talking about our faith. But Daniel doesn't compromise. He remains steadfast and faithful even in the belly of the beast. He's like staring the enemy right in the eye. He's standing right next to the king. And he doesn't sacrifice his morals. He doesn't compromise his standards. His faithfulness is unwavering. You know, I believe that when it comes to power and influence and things of that nature, I think the church, we've gotten a little confused on this sometimes. We think the only way to make a difference is if we get power. You know what I mean? Like if we're the ones in charge, if we're the ones making the decision. But what I think we need to realize is that the place where we can really shine is not when we're in charge, but when we are giving a faithful witness before the ones who are. Because for whatever it's worth, when you read the scriptures, when you look at history, that's when things really change. And it might be that is what we do best. You see, you don't need power to change the world. You need to be faithful before those in power. And so Daniel remains faithful to God, and God blesses him for it. And as a result, he remains prominent through the reign of 3 different kings and 2 different kingdoms, which brings us to the lion's den. There was a new king on the throne. His name was Darius. And apparently Daniel's work ethic and skills had got him some recognition in King Darius's reign. Page 526, Daniel chapter 6 now, verses 2 and 3. It says, "The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interests. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. There's that word place again. I want to bring us back to a Phil Tagg sermon from the Home Run Life series again. He said, faith doesn't make up for bad work. Faith doesn't make up for bad work. Sometimes I think Christians, we kind of get the heavenly mindset going and we think, oh, you know what? We're all going to go to heaven, so this stuff here doesn't matter. Right? It doesn't really matter what you do. This is all passing anyway. But there was a time where Christians were on the cutting edge of science and philosophy and art and music because our work was an act of worship. We did not think that God was simply saving souls from earth for heaven. He was redeeming this world right here, right now, and asking us to join him. And that would compel us to do the best work that we can. You see, God invites us to join him, and so everything that we say and do, Christians should do the best work we can because it's not just work, it's worship. I think that's Daniel's perspective. He was the very best at what he did. And sometimes part of being faithful before those in power is setting the curve on excellence. And that's what Daniel did. So it says King Darius made plans to place him over the entire empire. Now I want to be clear here. Daniel, not once in the story has Daniel made a grab for power. He's actually turned it down a few times because he wanted to make sure that God got all the credit. Because Daniel is not focused on being in charge. He's focused on being faithful. He happens to get power as a result, and even though it's going to cause him some problems here in a second, the result is that Daniel gets to speak truth. He gets to be a faithful witness before those in charge, and the world is changed because of it. So the king's officials, they don't like the idea of Daniel being their boss, and so they devise an evil plan. They get together and they say, you know what we'll do? We'll go to King Darius, and then we're going to appeal to his ego, which was considerable, apparently. And they say, hey, Darius, we have an idea. How about for the next 30 days, you write a law that says anybody who prays to anyone other than you gets thrown in the lion's den for a night. Sound good? And Darius says, sure, that sounds wonderful. And he writes it into law. I'm going to pick it up in verse 10. It says, but when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room, with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Okay, so once again, Daniel does not compromise. He, in fact, doesn't even close the windows. I don't know about you, I think I would have at least shut the windows, right? I mean, that's just a small step, and nobody can really blame you for that, but he doesn't even do that. He knows that he could lose everything, but he's not going to compromise his faith, because Daniel knows that when you compromise a little, you usually end up compromising everything. Remember, it's the law of the Dorito. And Daniel understands that. And so the moment he hears the law, he goes right upstairs into his room and prays like he always does. Okay, kind of reminds me of some other rule breakers, like this guy right here. Check this out. This guy doesn't care. He's going to break the rules. And then this one, I'm not convinced is actually real, because are you kidding me? These guys are going to hold hands. You can't stop them. Nobody's going to tell them not to. And that sign is asking for shoes to be left there, clearly. These guys are riding the shoulder. And this was my favorite. This guy is getting kicked out of Trinity College, I think. He's breaking every rule in the book. Can't say they didn't warn him. Listen, what would you have done if you were Daniel? Would you have at least shut the windows? I'm pretty sure I would have. But here's the thing. Faithfulness leaves the windows wide open. Faithfulness leaves the windows wide open. Hey, I got nothing to hide. I got nothing to hide. I'm not going to compromise my standards at all for your sake. Daniel's got a lot to lose. Power and position and reputation. Most importantly, his life. But those are all things that are a distant second compared to being obedient to his God. Now, some of you may know the story. King Darius loves Daniel. And he kind of realized that he kind of got tricked by his officials. And he didn't want to put Daniel in the lion's den, but he also didn't want to look weak. Remember? He had a big ego. Didn't want to look weak by breaking his own law. And so he had him thrown in the lion's den. And the next morning, it says that King Darius runs out to find Daniel. We'll pick it up in verse 19. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, Was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "Long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths, so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty." I want you to notice something here. I want you to notice how good Daniel is to King Darius. That tyrannical, egotistical, foolish, arrogant, evil king who had Daniel thrown to the lions just to save face. Daniel says, "I have not wronged you, your majesty." You know, one of the most remarkable things about Daniel, I think, is not simply his courage to speak truth or to hold his convictions. It is his goodness that drives him to be kind to those in charge as well. All throughout the book, Daniel exhibits this deep conviction about God's laws that other people's opinions of him are like barely a blip on his radar screen, but that does not mean that he doesn't care about other people. He never once utters a negative word. And you know, sometimes I worry that today we've confused being courageously faithful with simply being a jerk. Believe me, the two are not the same. Steve Deneff says that sometimes we lose our goodness in a cause. And I worry that that might be true. Adam Crooks and the early Wesleyans, they were people of radical, gutsy obedience. But they were also good, kind, gentle people. And I know that you have strong opinions about your candidate or about your politics. But you know, before you post that article that you're just sure has to be true, that you know is going to expose the bad guys for who they really are, that you're positive is going to change the tide of culture, think about this. What if it's not true and you just posted it? Or what if it is? You see, you can speak truth without love, but you won't be speaking the words of God, Christians. You can speak truth without love, but you won't be speaking the words of God. Daniel spoke truth with love, and here's what happened. Verse 25, chapter 6. Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. "Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions." And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Listen, the ability to speak truth to power is given to those who pursue faithfulness over power. And this is true at work, it's true at school, it's true in our community, in our country, it's true in our world. When we, the people of God, stand faithfully in that gap, things change. The world changes. Now, Cody Toops at South Campus is going to take over here in a moment, but I just want to leave us with this one last thing. A few centuries after Daniel, a man would stand in the gap for you. Jesus would stand before Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, a man who had considerable power. Jesus had been whipped and tortured. He was on his way to be crucified. And you know, Jesus takes that opportunity to remind Pilate of the nature of his power. It says that Jesus said, "You would have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above." You see, Jesus could very well have taken charge of the situation. He could have, of course, commanded legions of angels. But instead, he took the opportunity to tell the one in charge who's really in charge, to be a faithful witness before Pilate. And his faithful obedience would ultimately show the world what God is really like. And folks, that is our calling, to show the world what God is like. It's a God who loves and a God who serves and a God who dies, even for his enemies.